ladies and gentlemen, in the blue corner, standing at a sleek 5'11", 245 pounds, the tumultuous tempest of technique, Thomas Lilly. And in the red corner, at a curvaceous 5'11", 315 pounds, the jovial juggernaut of judgment, John Cheryl Sheridan. A meeting of the masters of mastication. Turn your attention as they delve deep into all things lifting and more. This is Peak Speak.
All right, we're back for another episode of Peak Speak. Episode number 7, I believe.
Is it? I don't know. I stopped counting after the first one.
The first one or number 0? Because number 0 we don't ever talk about again ever in our lives.
It wasn't a good one, was it?
No. Ladies and gentlemen, if this is the first one you're watching, please don't make the second one number 0. You will be chronically disappointed.
You're chronically disappointed, like just disappointed for a very long time.
Like disappointed at the human race as a race.
As a race, yeah, nice.
Man, it's very early and we're about to get very political. I'm clearing my brain.
I'm just trying to get my shit together so my computer doesn't. I'm not just staring at you instead of at the camera. I don't know what's going on. There's so many screens.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, if you're wondering why our eyes keep moving from camera to camera or away from...
The camera's crooked.
It's because we have about 4 cameras. I was thinking about this before and I was going to say, because, we're not technologically inclined or whatever. You know how old people always say that, especially in this kind of situation? The fact is, we are pretty technologically inclined. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty good. Like, I'm not the best.
I'm not bad.
But I'm okay. I think the technological problems that we've had are more a product of malfunctioning technology rather than you.
For certain. And it's got nothing to do with shitty tradesmen blaming their tools at all.
Never, exactly. It's weird, like on this screen, I look like death. On my camera, I look amazing. So hopefully we end up using that one.
What's the difference between good, cameras with good lighting and not good lighting? Because I look really good on my proper camera and less good on my computer screen. But
I don't know. But I'm really liking me in this video up here. I'm really not liking me down here. You look amazing.
Thank you. I'm not liking you in either of them, so,
That's pretty standard.
Indeed. All right, so what are we talking about?
Today's episode is kind of important. Well, I mean, all of them are really important.
We're
today's episode,
people, Thomas. Don't fucking ruin the illusion.
Yeah, we're definitely not nobodies. We're definitely not. All right. This episode is kind of opening a dialogue about the Powerlifting Federation situation happening in Australia, in Oceania, so New Zealand and the Pacific Islands as well. And as a consequence, due to the formation of a new world body, it's kind of worldwide news as well. And I came up with the idea of doing this as a podcast because there's a lot of talk going on about what's happening, but it seems to be quite biased, quite one-sided, and it doesn't seem to be a two-way dialogue. So from what I can see, or from what I've seen on the internet in the last month or two, the only person that's really speaking up and creating more of a dialogue that I've seen has been Brett Gibbs and his open questions to the New Zealand Powerlifting Federation. But we'll kind of talk about that as we go through. It's really important to note here that this episode is not a promotion of any federation. It's not an effort to slander or put down any federations or individuals. Again, this is just about creating an open dialogue about the current situation of powerlifting in the Oceania region and again, consequently worldwide, as we were talking about just before. So I thought the best way to start this would be to talk about why we are entitled to opinions here and why our opinion is A, unbiased, and B, relevant. So do you want to start with that?
Yeah, so I think I don't know if unbiased is necessarily the right word. I think bias is the sort of thing that everyone has. It's about acknowledging your bias and being aware of that. And I think that's the intention of this little bit, is to sort of lay on the table our cards and point out where we're from. I am the ACT's state rep for GPC in Australia. I run GPC affiliated meets and I compete predominantly in GPC. I have competed in other federations in the past. And I'm sure at some point we'll go into reasons for like why we picked each federation and stuff like that. But I coach lifters across all of the federations. I am never the sort of coach to force my lifters to go to a federation. I am a powerlifting coach first and foremost. I coach lifters and I want the lifters to be happy and satisfied in the avenue that they're pursuing. And for me, that means I support them wherever they go. Obviously, there are some limitations about where I'm allowed to coach and where I'm allowed to stand and things like that. And I understand those rules. I acknowledge that they're rules. I don't necessarily agree with them, but I'm not going to try and break those rules or anything like that, because for me, it's about the lifters that I coach and it's about getting them in a position where they are most comfortable so they can perform at their best. Now, everyone has their own choices about, or reasons behind their choices as to why they choose the federation that they do. I think powerlifting is very unique because we have the option. Any other sport in Australia, and you get one governing body. And because of that, I let my lifters compete wherever. Now, the fact that we run GPC affiliated meets means that most of my lifters compete in GPC because it's most accessible for them. It's in their own gym. They don't have to travel interstate. GPC in Canberra, we run three full lift, like 3 lift meets and a push-pull every year. Powerlifting Australia in Canberra, I think, has 1 and maybe 2 comps a year. And APU doesn't have any comps in Canberra yet. So the selection's limited, and therefore most of my lifters compete in GPC, but that's not to suggest that I push them in any direction. Ultimately, it's up to the lifter. And I think that's the really important part from a coach's perspective, and especially from our perspective, in that neither of us have a bias to which federation you should compete in, because you get to choose. That's the great part about this. I'm not your mother. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'll offer the pros and cons of all of them and let my lifters make the decision, but I'm never going to force them into any decision either way.
And we'll really touch on a few of those points that you said a little bit later on once we get right into the meat of this. By the way, I just requested a record thing on Zoom. I don't know if you got the permission.
I think I'm already recording it, so I think it's fine.
Oh, I thought we record from both ends. But anyway.
No, I think I just record it and it's sweet.
Sam, media guy, media team. Sorry,
media team. Our media team will sort this
out. All right. And a few things you touched on there. I mean, you talked about loving powerlifting and being a powerlifting coach as a whole, right? And I think that's how this relationship really started. We're both very passionate about powerlifting, and I've always recognized that you're really neutral like that. You really cross the board and have a broad view and a good understanding, which is why I have so much respect for you. Also, we both love burgers, beers, and dogs, so that helps a lot.
What more is there to life?
Exactly. I think you've kind of understated your role a little bit. Like, you have been pivotal in the growth of powerlifting in your region. And without saying pompous or biased, I believe that I have been pivotal in the growth of powerlifting in the Gold Coast as well. And it's just the nature of what our gyms are and what they do and the service that they provide. Again, all these things we will touch on in greater detail later on. Acknowledging that powerlifting in both our respective areas did exist before we came along. Like, we did not create powerlifting where we are, but we've contributed to it in a quite significant way, I believe.
Yes,
and that's why I think we have such a relevant voice in this space, is that we have been key drivers of the growth of powerlifting in our respective areas. We both coach lifters across federations. We both attend competitions across federations. I've attended competitions of basically every major federation that we have in Australia and those affiliations internationally as well. I've competed and coached in IPF. I'm a current member of the IPF. A lot of people don't know that. I've competed and coached in GPC, in CAPO, and there's there's several banners under CAPO and WRPF as well. So, our experience over the years, and especially our experience now as coaches over the years, has given us exposure to all of the federations that we have on offer in Australia currently. Above that, we're kind of in the positions that we are in. We're distributors of the sport of powerlifting. If the top end of the federations, the executives, all that kind of, whatever you want to call them, the people at the top, if they are the producers of the sport of powerlifting, we're the distributors. We get it out to the people. That's our role as coaches and as gym owners. And because of that, this impacts us. It impacts us from a powerlifting perspective, and because powerlifting is our business, it also impacts us from a business perspective, which is why we've chosen to talk about this today, right?
Yep, certainly. And that business thing is a really important point to touch on. And I think we'll go into that as we get further into things. But from a business perspective, that's a fairly substantial impact, or has a fairly substantial impact upon why I choose to be affiliated with GPC and run GPC meets and things like that. But we'll go into that later.
Yes, of course. So it's important to note from this point that the information that we're going to present outside of our own personal opinions on the situation, because that's what this is about. This is about analyzing what there is, what's being given to us as a powerlifting community information-wise, and then putting our opinions on it. The information that we present, we have been very, very careful to ensure that it is all pre-existing media. It's all been written or spoken. We are not making things up. It's just important that we note that right here at the start. So we'll start with the current situation. Current situation is that PA, OPF, so Powerlifting Australia, OPF, Oceania Powerlifting Federation, the previous IPF affiliates in Australia and regionally in Oceania, along with Robert Wilkes, have been expelled from the IPF. That happened in 2017. All the reasons, all the court cases, all of that has been spoken about elsewhere at large. I don't think we really need to get into that in great depth.
No,
right?
I think there are, if you want to find out more about that, there are plenty of other places to talk about it. There's been interviews with Wilkes himself. There's been all kinds of media and stuff like that. So if you want to delve into that deeper, you can do your own research on that front.
Yes. So as a result of that happening, a few actions have happened since. There was an attempt to form a new IPF that kind of didn't get off the ground for a while there. And then another party stepped up and he has created APU, so Australian Powerlifting Union. That is now the current IPF affiliate in Australia. Drug testing in the APU was secured for a time there from SDTI, which is Sports Drug Testing International. And Sports Drug Testing International was threatened with legal action. And because of that threat, they decided to, at the time, withdraw from connection with the APU. So the current APU drug testing protocols or regimes are the biggest thing in question and one of the biggest arguments from the opposition, which at the moment is Powerlifting Australia. The collateral, the onflowing effect of all of this sort of stuff, a big thing is New Zealand at the moment. So New Zealand is currently IPF affiliated through the New Zealand Powerlifting Federation. Through previous OPF, New Zealand and Australia, so NZPF and PA, were quite close. And they're currently still quite close. So the New Zealand IPF affiliate has their nationals next month in August. And at their nationals, they have an AGM. At the AGM, there is currently on list a vote to determine whether NZPF stays IPF or leaves the IPF. So the new federation that has risen as part of this expulsion from the IPF is World Powerlifting. So New Zealand Powerlifting Federation is deciding whether World Powerlifting. The purpose of this chat now is to kind of talk about the points that have been raised in favor of World Powerlifting, to talk about, to open then a dialogue as to the benefits and deficits of going either way. So we might jump straight into that and talk about that a little bit more. So I really wanted to talk about this first because this is relevant to us, especially in Australia, because the information that has been spread about World Powerlifting has come primarily through Australian lifters. The reason that has happened is because Powerlifting Australia, Robert Wilkes himself, so the CEO of Powerlifting Australia, isn't really active on social media. Social media is the driver of what? Everything these days?
Yeah, life.
So, you know, life. Yeah, love life. So a lot of the information that has come out through social media via lifters. So let's talk about World Powerlifting. Let's talk about what points have been listed as benefits for World Powerlifting. So they've got the new weight classes. There's slight changes in weight classes, and there's a few additional weight classes for women to have equal number of weight classes for men and women. There's been the removal of the approved equipment list, which is really cool because that's one of the what I would deem one of the biggest negatives of the IPF is that you have to compete wearing the equipment that they say is okay to wear. So World Powerlifting has removed that and replaced it with just equipment standards. You know, your belt can only be 10 centimeters wide, up to 13 millimeters thick, all that kind of stuff. In the deadlifts, they've removed the rule that says that women have to wear t-shirts. Now women can take off their shirts and wear sports bras under their soft suits when they deadlift, which is really important because at powerlifting competitions, there are a lot of videos and photos that come up, and the more jacked you look, the better in general.
That's why I'm going to start wearing a sports bra when I compete. I'm going to look real jacked.
You know, one of the only times I've ever taken my shirt off in deadlifts at competition, you were semi-ing me at a comp in 2016. It was my first comp back from my 2 surgeries, and my nipples were all over.
Was it Pro Raw?
It wasn't Pro Raw. It was the one before that. It was the one I used to qualify for Pro Raw. My nipples were uncontrollable. They were all over the place. And because of that reason, I was in a very ill-fitting soft suit, considering I weighed 116 kilos, and previously I wore that soft suit at 95 kilos. Because of that reason, I will never take my shirt off again, including in the shower, including in the house, because I was extremely embarrassed.
I feel like we should bring back the old school, what's that? I think he's a Russian weightlifter, Vasily something, had the
super low cut
through here. That's what I'm all about. Just nips out. I think nips
it's
should
like it's a reverse teabag.
Yeah. I also think there should be a minimum body fat percentage before you're allowed to take your shirt off. I think anyone sub 15% shouldn't be allowed to take their shirt off. Everyone above that should have the option.
Will Crozier walks into the gym every day and makes me hate myself and my body even more.
Yeah, that's reasonable.
How is it possible to be such an Adonis?
I don't understand.
Don't understand. All right, anyway, getting off track. WP has announced that there will be push-pull comps, so deadlift bench press comps and deadlift only. IPF previously has only done 3 lift and bench only competitions. They've talked about their drug testing policies and structure being absolutely paramount and best of the best. In a recent interview with Robert Wilkes, he was questioned about how his federation will be different from the IPF. And basically what he said was because the governance in the IPF has deteriorated and there wasn't a lot more said on that subject, he referred to World Powerlifting as a body of integrity. And he did say that there would be opportunity in this transitional period for world powerlifting lifters to compete in IPF competitions, provided that those IPF competitions are drug tested. So tested at the day, which is part of the IPF bylaws. That's a very similar rule to what the IPF has currently. So would you like to shed any thoughts on those changes? What are your opinions on those changes? What do you think?
So I'm all for people making progress. And I think that, you know, they're making progress towards things that shouldn't have been rules to begin with. And the problem with that is all of these rules, or most of these rules and the changes and stuff like that, are things that every powerlifting federation across the world has been doing otherwise.
Exactly.
I like spouting the idea that women don't have to wear shirts in deadlifts and that's a good thing now. Like, that should never have been a fucking rule in the first place. Like, you know, if you want to talk about equality, not letting women take their shirt off but making men, allowing men to take their shirt off, that's pretty fucking ridiculous if you ask me. I think the removal of the approved equipment is great. I think that's a huge barrier for a lot of people competing in IPF competitions because, and I know, you know, I've had lifters who have done maybe a novice comp or two and then they're looking to join a federation, and we talk about pros and cons of each, and inevitably the approved equipment list comes up. And, you know, some of these people are relatively new lifters to the sport. Maybe they bought a cheap belt on eBay or something like that, and now they have to go out and spend a couple of $100 to get an IPF approved belt. That's often a huge hurdle for people because it just makes that barrier for entry so much higher. We're obviously going to talk about that when we talk about novice comps and stuff like that, but I think that's the really important part for growing a sport is a low barrier to entry. And I think things like an approved equipment list make that, like, they just raise that barrier beyond what I think is reasonable. So I think with a lot of these, like especially those first few, the weight classes, the approved equipment list, shirts in deadlifts and push-pull and deadlift comps, like that's stuff that every federation or most federations in the world have been doing anyway. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily a pro for world powerlifting. I think that just brings them to par for the course. Doesn't make them any better than any other federation? No, I don't think so, because you can find all of those rules in other federations across the world. As far as the drug testing and stuff goes, I mean, obviously we want that to be as transparent and as fair and that sort of thing as possible. I don't have much experience nor knowledge in that region, and therefore don't really feel like I'm in a position to comment extensively on it. I think it's a good thing that they're pushing to have the most fair and just and transparent drug testing policies. I think that's really important for a drug tested federation to have that. But, you know, it's all sort of really hearsay at this point because none of it's really been proven and it's all very new. So the thing is, you can sort of go on about all of these things as, you know, this is how we're going to do it and it's all going to be great. But until we actually see it in action, we actually see reports about it, you know, all these sort of things, I think it's hard to stand on that as a like a real sort of stepping stone for things, because it puts you in a position where there's no real proof behind what you're talking about. It's all just, this is our plan, and you can have the greatest plan in the world, but yeah, until it's in action, it's hard to justify, I think.
Okay, one really important thing that you touched on when you were talking about all that was the growth of powerlifting. And that's, when I read this list, because I do think this is progression from the previous IPF model that OPF was working underneath.
Yep, I definitely agree.
It kind of highlights a lot of the things that were that are not so great about the IPF. So I do think it is a progression, a move away from that. My question is, the thing that immediately screams out to me is, how does this actually help the growth of powerlifting? Is this enough? Is this enough to drive further growth? Is this enough to differentiate from IPF to be relevant competition to the IPF, which is ultimately what this aims to achieve. And is it enough to gather other nations to come on board? So, when we're talking about other nations and coming on board, World Powerlifting at the moment, and this is only by information that has been divulged from the executive of World Powerlifting, which as far as we know is just Robert Wills. There hasn't been any official information or websites or data or anything about who's making these decisions. As far as we know, it's coming from Robert Wills directly. Sorry, what was I just saying?
Oceania.
Yeah, sorry. Sam, can you please fix that? Just, I don't know, do something about it.
If you could just replace Thomas and get me a better co-host, that'd be great. Thanks, Sam.
Buddy's available. Member nations currently, as far as we know, confirmed member nations in World Powerlifting worldwide. He's got 100% Raw, which is a US federation. There are a couple of countries in Asia. And there's a little bit of bickering between IPF and World Powerlifting when it comes to the Asia situation. It's kind of beyond the scope because there isn't a lot of information out there about it. So we can't really talk about it too much. And then there's the Pacific. So in the Pacific, so far, we know for sure, Australia, Nauru. That's it. From the information that we've collected, I'm pretty well connected in the Pacific, and
oh, look at me, I'm well connected.
Look, can you be serious for 1 second of your life? Just 1 second.
I'll try, but I make no guarantees.
Yeah, as far as we know in the Pacific, the only confirmed nations so far are Nauru and Australia. Until it's presented otherwise, that's all the information we have. Currently, New Zealand, again, is still a member of the IPF. If in August it decides to switch to World Powerlifting, there'll be a third body. There's an important implication with that, which is Oceania Powerlifting Champs, which happens, I believe, in November/December this year in Nauru. We'll talk about that in a second as well. Coming back to the question of growth, this turns into our opinions now. My opinion, having been in the sport of powerlifting as a competitor for 10 years, as an observer for 12 to 13 years, the explosion, the growth in powerlifting has really happened since about 2011/12. From there, it's grown exponentially. And we're not just talking about GPC or PTC, we're talking about powerlifting as a whole. The market as a whole has grown. I mean, Brisbane is a great example. In 2012, you had 2 powerlifting gyms in Brisbane. Iron Underground, which is like the OG, that was an IPF affiliate, or it still is, IPF affiliated. Paul Thompson does a great job running that. And at the time, PTC Brisbane, Scott Wasson, which is now Valhalla Strength, those 2 were the only that exist. Fast forward 5 years or 6 years to 2018, we have upwards of 20 powerlifting gyms in Brisbane, not including Gold Coast, just in Brisbane. That is a lot of powerlifting in a very condensed area. Now, in my experience, in my observation, in my competitive history, my coaching history, I believe that the growth of powerlifting has been facilitated almost exclusively by the increase in accessibility and promotion via powerlifting gyms and novice competitions. What do you think?
I totally agree with you. I touched on it briefly earlier about the barrier to entry. So when I started competing in 2010, my first competition was a unaffiliated novice comp at Elite Physique in Canberra, which at the time was the only gym that you'd even consider like a powerlifting gym. And even they were, like, they're a commercial gym that had a small section of powerlifting equipment. Brisbane's obviously much, much bigger than Canberra, so it's the scope is a little bit different, but the story's the same in Canberra. I did the one comp that was hosted in Canberra a year. Before that, I think it was 2009, Elite Physique hosted Capo Nationals. But prior to that, it was like one comp a year. And from 2013, I opened PTC Canberra, which has since become Burley Strength. We started running meets in 2014. I now run somewhere between 8 and 10 meets a year. And we average 30 plus people at those comps. In those comps, there was maybe a handful of females. Next weekend, not this coming weekend, but the weekend after, we've got our annual Ladies of Lifting comp. We've got 60 women on the books. It's going to be a huge day. And look, to be honest, having been at the core of the growth of the sport in Canberra, novice comp's the only way to do it. It's that barrier to entry that, like, if you want to go and play AFL, you don't just rock up to the MCG on a Friday night, pull your socks up and run onto the field, right? Maybe you go to the park and you kick a footy with some mates, and then maybe you go play like in a local, evening league or something like that. And I think that's what, before the growth of novice comps, that's what powerlifting lacked. There was no funnel to get new people into the sport. Prior to that, you had to be a member of a federation. You had to own a soft suit. In some cases, you had to have the right, brands of equipment and things like that. And it makes that barrier to entry really high. Powerlifting is an incredibly accessible sport when it's presented in the right way, because ultimately, anyone who's ever really stepped foot in a gym has probably done some variation of a squat, a bench, and a deadlift at some point. And thus, it makes it a really easy transition for people who've never lifted or never thought about lifting competitively to transition into that. I have people like, we had a woman last year, I think it was, who was 70 and did her first ever powerlifting meet at 70 years old. We've had mums, dads, young kids, older people. Like, the scope for powerlifting is so huge because it's so accessible, and because it's not, here's the minimum standard and you must meet this before you get to it, which is kind of where strongman, I think, falls down sometimes, is they often have, like, these are the weights that you have to use. Whereas because powerlifting, you get to choose your attempts, it becomes much, much more accessible, right? And in order to continue to make it accessible and to continue to funnel people into the federations, because ultimately you want to grow the top end of the sport, right? You want the sport to be big. We want the sport to be something that lots of people see, that there's money involved in, all of those sort of things. But it happens from the grassroots. And without that funnel where people are like, oh, well, I have to spend $100 plus on a federation membership, another $80 on a soft suit, that's $200. I used to play a whole season of rugby for less than that. And I think that has, like you said, has been such an important part of the growth of the sport, because it's removed those barriers. It's made things, something that was, initially, I don't think I'll compete. It's a little bit too seriously. I don't want to spend the money, blah, blah, blah. Instead, you make it so accessible, like, pay your entry fee, rock up in what you wear to the gym on a regular basis, and just lift some weights. And that's what powerlifting should really be about.
Yes, so that kind of defines, when we say novice comps, what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Really, almost, we're talking about social powerlifting.
Yeah.
It's not about removing the importance of competition, because we are trying to breed healthy competition.
No, not at all.
Talking about unsanctioned novice events,
yeah.
Because recognizing here, PA do run novice competitions, and that's based on your competition experience, which is how we also define novices.
Yep.
Right? The difference is no membership, no affiliations. Now, I have to play, it's not even devil's advocate, I have to speak for the opposite argument here, because Wilkes has been quoted as novice comps being a false, dumb marketing idea and devaluing the concept of the sport of powerlifting. The reason he talks about it like this, and I do understand his perspective, is that he's saying that if you're just having a go, if you're just in shorts and t-shirt, A, it lessens the sport. I don't really agree with that. But B, they're talking more from a drug testing perspective. Wilkes is very, 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 very set on level playing field, very, very set on no drugs in sport. Totally understand that. Totally agree with that viewpoint in terms of, making sure that everything you practice underneath that belief is consistent. So they're doing that. They're making sure that you don't get, someone who's really keen to do the powerlifting comp, who's never touched a drug in their life, and another novice competitor coming along that's been on gear for a while and is really big and jacked and strong, beating it. They're trying to prevent that, which I do understand, and it comes back down to your definition, your understanding, and your reason for novice competitions. The reason our novice competitions are successful is because they're a dip of the toe in the water.
Yeah.
They're a taste of powerlifting. They're have-a-go kind of situations. Again, we provide reward for good performance. We reward the best lifters at the competition. We give away trophies because that's what competition is. However, the seriousness of it is all dulled down. That's why there is no federation membership. That's why there is no soft suit and equipment and all that sort of stuff. It's really to have a go that so you can decide, hey, you know what? I really love my experience at that novice competition, no matter where I came in the field, and I'm going to get more serious about this. That's when you make an informed decision about which of the wonderful federations that we have here. Because make no mistake, powerlifting in Australia is fucking awesome.
Yep, 100%, and well beyond what you see in the places in the likes of like the US and things like that. You know, really up until like last year, Australia had 2 federations, and I think that's really what we need, right? We need a drug tested and an untested federation, one with knee wraps, one without knee wraps. Like that's a great way to do things, right? But the thing, I can certainly see where Wilkes is coming from on this idea, but I think the analogy needs to be drawn to other sports, right? That's like, I think the idea of devaluing the sport is a really interesting one to sort of pick apart. To me, that suggests that like social Sunday soccer, which I've spent a bit of time playing because like I have no desire to be a professional soccer player, but occasionally I like to go and kick a ball around and have a bit of fun on a Sunday and then go drink a beer, right? But that doesn't devalue the sport of soccer. That brings me into the world of soccer, right? And I think that, like you said, it's that dipping of the toe into the sport. The best analogy I've got from my own experience, right, is the thing I'm doing most in my own sort of athletic pursuits at the moment is climbing rocks. I'm been into bouldering, which is like rock climbing without ropes. And there's a climbing gym around the corner from my lifting gym that I go to that did exactly that. Like that introduced me to the sport of bouldering. I rocked up, I hired a pair of shoes for like $6. I paid my $20 entry and I had a fucking great time. Since then, I spent a couple of $100 on a pair of shoes. You know, I bought chalk bags and like bought all the gear, and I'm now like, I'm invested in the sport because I had that opportunity to come in at a really low barrier, experience the sport, experience what it's about, and now I've been doing it for nearly a year and I'm substantially better than I was, right? And I think that's really the point that novice comps do, is it gives people who, like, you know, the best example I've got is, like, we've got plenty of people who are in their mid-30s who haven't done anything competitively in an athletic realm for 2 decades. You know, like, I think I'm in a somewhat unique position in that I've been competing in competitive sports since I was 6. I'm now 29. I played soccer for several years. I played over a decade of rugby, and I've now been competing as a powerlifter for nearly 10 years. Now, I'm a competitor. That's what I do. I really enjoy competition, and I've had an avenue for that from the get-go, and powerlifting was exactly the same. I tried a novice comp, and fuck yeah, this is awesome. Now I'm going to take this more seriously. And since then, I've competed at nationals, I've set records, all those sort of things, but without that novice comp, if I'd had to spend $200 or $300 on equipment and a federation membership and all of that sort of stuff just to try it, I would have been far less inclined to actually be involved in the sport. And without wanting to toot my own horn, that would mean powerlifting in Canberra would not be where it is. And without that novice comp, it just wouldn't exist in the same way in Canberra. Because, like you, I've been very pivotal in the growth of the sport in my region, and will continue to be so because it's a sport that I really, really fucking love. And the more people we get into it, and the more people we open their eyes to the sport, the better it's going to be from the top down, right? You you can't just push the top end of the sport and expect the rest to catch up, because then it becomes this unattainable sort of level where it's like, well, I can never compete with that because I can't squat 300 kilos. So what's the fucking point? But, you know, I played rugby, and years ago I had dreams of pulling on an Australian jersey, and I very quickly realised I'm not that person, and that's okay. But I still fucking watch rugby. I mean, I'm less inclined to watch rugby at the moment because Australian rugby sucks, but that's not the sport's fault. That's Australian rugby, and that's a whole fucking different podcast. But I continue to be involved in the sport despite not competing at the top level, right? And I think that's where these novice comps come in. It's this opportunity for so many people who never would have considered competing in a sport at all to jump in and get their feet wet. And I think the competition side of things is really important. I push everyone who I coach to do one comp at least, right? It's not about like, oh, you train at my gym, you have to be a powerlifter now, but the reason I push people towards it is because it gives you an end date, for one. It's like, okay, my training stops here and this is the testing point, and I've got to do all the work that gets to that point. The other really important thing, and it sort of ties into that, is it shows you that when it fucking matters, like when it's on the line and you have to step up and perform right now, you can. That's the really cool thing about powerlifting, and it gives people who wouldn't otherwise have a competitive outlet for that an outlet to do it. Like without powerlifting, I'd still be playing rugby. I got into powerlifting because I broke my hand punching someone in the face on the rugby field. In my defense, he threw the first punch, but that was the end of my rugby career. I said, okay, I'm going to take 6 months off. I'll train as a powerlifter for a while, I'll compete in this powerlifting comp, and I'll probably go back to rugby. Had I not done that first novice comp while I was still playing rugby, I wouldn't have been a competitive powerlifter. I would have still been playing footy because I'm a competitor. I like to do that. And so without that novice comp, I know I wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be having this discussion. And so for me, it's how I got into the sport, and that's why I want to spread the message to the rest of the world.
I was actually powerlifting in PA before I did a novice comp. So I'd competed in PA before I did a novice comp, but the comp that kind of solidified, okay, this is the sport for me, was a novice comp that I did. It was in 2011, and that's when I decided, because I had competed in BMX before that, and I'd kind of decided which direction am I going. That comp really solidified it for me. But we need to move on because we still have a lot of stuff to cover, and we love talking about ourselves sometimes. All right. I want to jump a few points ahead to the Pacific problem. Now, like I said, like to talk about ourselves a lot. I have a big heart for Pacific nations outside of powerlifting because my job previously, working for the Queensland government as a community nutritionist, all my projects, all the research I did, I'm about to get published in another journal article, is all around Pacific Island nature. So I love the culture, I love the people. Anyone who follows me on social media would have seen that I've recently just gone over to Papua New Guinea to support a competition over there. That's been one of the best experiences of my life. I really, really love it. The Pacific nations, so Oceania Powerlifting Federation previously took care of the Pacific nations. When I say took care of, I mean from a federation point of view, as in they provided an outlet, a banner for those nations to be a part of and compete under. At the moment, they're kind of stuck in this proverbial tug of war between IPF and World Powerlifting. I can't speak for all of the Pacific nations, like I said before, but I do have very reliable information. And from that reliable information, the OPF, the IPF, PA, WP, all those big banners, all those big names, have never really given any meaningful help to the Pacific nations besides the Pacific Games. So the Pacific Games is a competition that happens every 4 years. Think of it as the Olympics for the Pacific Islands. So multidisciplinary sports, lots and lots of different sports, really, really big deal. A lot of veneration, a lot of hype around it, and there's money that gets pumped into it as well. Really, really important for the Pacific nations from a sporting perspective. So there's only really been support from the major federations at the top around those things. It's kind of, there's really not much question around why that happens. It kind of keeps them going through the motions of powerlifting, but also there's a lot of money involved. Yeah, that's a rabbit hole we won't really go down right now. The problem is that it's self-satisfying. It doesn't actually help grow the sport in the regions. It kind of keeps those regions, or keeps those nations, on a tether. You know, there's been no support from the regions in terms of coaching development, in terms of sport development, in terms of grassroots development. And when I say that, I mean, when you're working with communities like that, and you're providing support, the colonialistic view is kind of like, we know everything, we're going to give that to you, which is really a take mentality. It's really like, here's the information for you at this point of time, but we're going to keep that information, walk away and give it to you when we want it, right? What really needs to happen in the islands, if the sport is going to continue to grow, is that it needs to be community driven and led, right? So the Pacific nations have kind of been crying out for support from a coaching perspective. They want to upskill coaches, they want to upskill referees, they want to have it as a well-oiled machine that they can run themselves. So they're self-sufficient. At the moment, they don't really have a lot of those skills, a lot of those resources, the equipment, the gyms, all of those things are kind of missing. All of those things that we're accustomed to here, especially if you're new to the sport, we are very spoiled. Very, very spoiled. That doesn't exist over there. I mean, I've been to the islands. I've seen the state of the gyms. We're talking legitimate dirt floors under a house on stilts, with like the oldest bent rusted bars, the oldest school York plates that you can ever think of, really, really low levels of equipment that are producing some really amazing lifters as well. Financial support hasn't really been given from the major federations. You know, PNG, they charge $3 to enter a competition because they can't afford the kind of memberships and competition fees that we would charge over here, for example. So one of the biggest attacks from World Powerlifting, or I shouldn't say attacks is the wrong word. One of the biggest criticisms from World Powerlifting is the lack of testing in APU, IPF, which again, as we kind of touched on before, is a little bit funny because they've been the key preventative measure from the APU getting that testing through their legal action against SDTI and APU. And the criticism comes from like whereabouts systems, TUEs, out of comp testing, all that sort of stuff. Right, so APU aside, there is no infrastructure whatsoever in the island nations, and there has not been for a very, very long time. There is no out of competition testing in the island nations. There's very rarely testing at comps, if ever, besides the major comps. So the question is raised, if that's the criticism of IPF, OPF, don't forget that the current leadership of WP has been in charge of that region for upwards of 20 years, and yet no anti-doping systems have been implemented or established in the islands. What's going to change now? That is the question that is raised out of all this. How is this different? What is going to change if all the island nations, including New Zealand, decide to go with WP? New Zealand's a little bit different. They do have anti-doping structures in place. The Oceania Championships is an important point. So this year it's going to be in Nauru. An Oceania Championships, so a regional championships, has to happen for a sport to be allowed to compete in the Pacific Games. Next year is the Pacific Games. So there's a need to have a championships happen. At the moment, the only countries that we know are in the Oceania Champs, Australia and New Zealand. They're the only countries currently signed up to World Powerlifting. So there's kind of a ticking timeline as well as to whether other countries will come on board, and they need to make those decisions based on the information they have from either IPF or World Powerlifting. You know, it's been quoted that without World Powerlifting, without their support that the Oceania nations are rudderless, where the truth is that those nations have been kind of rudderless for years and years and years under the same leadership regime. So again, what's going to change? And a lot of the old OPF meetings, there was a lack of quorum, so a lack of representations from all of the island nations, because a lot of these nations are lacking in funds, and flying around is expensive. You look at flights from like somewhere like Fiji to Nauru, you have to fly through Brisbane. It can cost you upwards of $3,000. You know, it's quite difficult to get to places like that and quite difficult to get around. And if those people are kind of volunteering their time and not making money out of the sport of powerlifting, they're just regular guys and girls. And on the islands, you're not really a rich guy or girl. It's interesting to note that, you know, they didn't have the funds to attend a lot of these meetings. Quorum wasn't established, but the IPF, or at the time the OPF, shouldered the cost of certain other executives to be flown around to go to these meetings. How is that reasonable? How is that fair? How is that going to change moving forward? That is what this all comes down to, is what is this new federation going to provide that's different to the old federation? And if the leadership is no different and the same issues exist, the changes that we listed before, the positives that they've moved away from the rules in the IPF, are kind of really fluffy compared to all this other big stuff. You know, the changes currently seem a little bit arbitrary, a little bit celebrating for the sake of celebrating. Then these kind of nations have to put up, they have to compare the new World Powerlifting with the current IPF. So in a recent conversation that I had live on Facebook with Chad Wesley Smith, name dropping there, we briefly touched on whether World Powerlifting would be viable, and he kind of raised the same question: how do you compete with something like IPF? Listen to some of these stats on the IPF. They're under IOC recognition process. Granted, that's been happening for a long time and probably won't ever get recognized.
Yeah, powerlifting's not going to be in the Olympics, people. Let's just like draw a line in the sand. Let's pursue another avenue, because it's just not going to end up in the Olympics. It's not entertaining enough. It's a sport that, like, the Olympics already has one barbell-based sport, or one, you know, real pure strength sport, and it's rife with drug controversy and has been close to being kicked out of the Olympics on several occasions because of the drug controversy. Powerlifting's no different, and often worse. And so I think the IOC recognition thing is a funny thing in my head. I don't quite understand why we need to pursue the Olympics. Like, don't get me wrong, the Olympics is the pinnacle of sport for sure, but I feel like that's just it's an avenue that's not really worth investing in, because anyone who understands anything about this is sure to see through this and see that the IOC is just never going to recognise a sport that's full of drug controversy like powerlifting. Like, fuck, rock climbing's in the Olympics in 2020, and I guarantee you there's nowhere near as much drug controversy in rock climbing as there is in powerlifting. So yeah, I've always thought the IOC argument's a weird one, and not necessarily a point for or against. I think it's largely irrelevant, and for the vast majority of people, and that's where I think some of these things are often, some of these like changes and differences in world bodies and stuff like that, for 99% of the lifters, especially in Australia, like, it doesn't actually matter. A lot of this stuff is changing things at the top tier, at that elite 1%, and it's just not relevant for the growth of the sport from the grassroots.
Exactly, and we'll come back to that in a second. Some further accolades that the IPF has. You know, they're a member of the Global Organization of International Sports Federations, Alliance of Independent Recognized Members of Sport, World Games Associate, Sport Accord Convention. They have 113 current member nations. The leadership is democratic. It's 4 years. It's 4-year elections. It's not dictated by one person at the top with a board. It's an executive committee versus a board. That's a really important point, because if there's issues with leadership, it needs to change. And I think that kind of has affected powerlifting Australia, because the ousting was more about one person than it was about the federation itself, and the lifters have kind of become cannon fodder in all of that. The IPF sends equipment to regions for development. There's lots of big name sponsors in the sport. The WADA compliant tier 1. They've got an independent DHP panel who review all the positive cases. They've got a big following, 2.4 million viewers on the live stream for Worlds, 600,000 followers on Facebook. There's a lot of backing behind the IPF, and that's going to be an extremely difficult giant to take down. So that's really important to note. You were saying before about the top-down sort of approach, and the fact that a lot of these changes are not as relevant. So, you know, one of the arguments against IPF is the potentially questionable financial practices. They've been raised publicly quite a bit over this whole period. I can say that I have had lifters in interesting predicaments in that sort of situation. So whatever is happening at the top, I don't know. And you know, we don't know. That's kind of, yeah. Because there's no solid hard data on it, it's kind of like, well, we can only go with what we do know, and what we do know about both federations, you know, again, IPF is going to be a very difficult giant to fight. I think there has been some questionable financial practices in PA as well over the years. And again, this is just from experiences of lifters. And when I say questionable, I'm not talking about widespread corruption or anything like that. Just things that kind of make you say, you know, does that really need to happen? And again, it's kind of outside of the scope of this, because unless it's been written, unless it's been presented, it's not something that we can really... It's
all hearsay.
It is. It's exactly hearsay. Now, on the financial thing, one of the biggest arguments for PA, for OPF, for now World Powerlifting, is that the leadership has injected a lot of money into the sport. Let me say that I think that is a good thing. I think that it has been important in growing the sport. I know you and I have injected a lot of our own money into our businesses to make them grow at Grassroots. But let's come back to the fact that these are businesses. I run a business, you run a business. A powerlifting federation is a business, and a business that has been running for 20 plus years. If they're still injecting their own money from outside of that business into the business in order to try and make it grow, when you have much younger businesses in the form of federations not having to do that, my question is, does this need to be celebrated, or is this just poor business practice? You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's definitely what I would have thought. Like, you know, apart from the initial capital that I put into setting up the gym, I haven't had to put any more money in. It's been a self-sustaining thing. It's paid me a wage. It's done all these things because it's a good business. Like, and I don't claim to be some sort of high-flying business guru or anything like that, but I found an avenue that I'm passionate about. I put some money in to start, and it's been self-funded since. You know, it continues to grow. We run comps. We're not losing money on any of these comps or anything like that. I'm not having to pour buckets of cash in, because ultimately I don't have buckets of cash to pour into it. And thus that's put me in a position where I've had to make it work. And I don't see how bad business practice, which is ostensibly what something like this is, needs to be celebrated. I don't see how that's relevant. Like, sure, it's great that there's a commitment to the cause on that front, but you can be committed to a cause and still not be very good at it, and I don't think that needs to be celebrated.
Yeah. So, kind of the final point that I want to touch on, because again, this all comes back to what's going to change. Because effectively the new federation is not much different to the old federation.
That certainly seems like the case at this point. Obviously, there's not a lot of hard evidence to go on that, in terms of we haven't seen it, you know, come to fruition yet. It's all still very much talk, but
very young, very young.
But the talk that I've heard and the talk that you've heard and that sort of thing, it really seems like it's just a very, very similar federation. Maybe some minor changes that probably shouldn't have been rules in the first place. And overall, it just seems like the same thing under a different moniker.
Yes. Yeah, and it keeps coming back to this question is what's different? How is this going to grow? I think the PA model, the Powerlifting Australia model, and now the World Powerlifting model, the biggest impact on growth that there is, and this has always been unique to Australia, is the, and this is me with a heart for coaching now, is the prevention of coaches outside of that federation not being able to be within that federation unless it's total exclusivity. The exclusivity is what kills the growth. The exclusivity is what prevents the growth. So it's the 1.3 rule, right? So I mentioned before that World Powerlifting has said that lifters will be able to compete in IPF comps as long as they're tested. You'll notice on the PA website there has been a lot of 1.3 sanctions. So 1.3 is the association rule, as in it's when you compete, officiate, or coach in a federation outside of Powerlifting Australia. There's been a lot of sanctions on that rule with people who have gone and done APU comps because, again, stipulated that drug testing rule because their SDTI hasn't been able to test at IPF meets in Australia currently because of the resistance that they've received because of the lawsuits. The way I kind of rationalize or think about it in my head is like going to a food court, right? Imagine you go to a food court, right? There's 5 of us or 6 of us or whatever, and I go and eat at McDonald's, and I really like McDonald's. And McDonald's says to me, you know what, you can come and eat here as much as you want, but you can only eat here. You can talk to people that eat KFC, you can talk to people that are eating a kebab shop, whatever, but you can only eat here. And your friends that are over there, if they want to come and eat here, they have to forgo all of that. And what happens with that is, you know, if McDonald's is saying you can only eat here, but you can talk to them, but there's enough hearsay to say if you talk to them, you're going to get in trouble. The McDonald's people are going to congregate over here, and all the other food court people are going to kind of mingle and talk to each other. Very, very similar here. PA is very exclusive, and because of the exclusivity, you see businesses surrounded around PA. Then you see businesses like ours, which are more holistic and approaching, you know, catering for all powerlifters. But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy because you and I are always unbiased when we present to our lifters what the benefits of federations are, which is why we both have lifters that compete in PA, because we are never going to discourage that lifter's desire to compete wherever they want. However,
I've actively encouraged people to go to Powerlifting Australia because it's the better option for them and their goals.
Exactly. But, you know, if a lifter, especially a new lifter, is like, well, you know, I need a coach. I need someone to look after me. You can't come to that comp, that's all right, I'll go to where you're allowed to go to. And it kind of funnels people in either direction. It also impacts the lifter's choices about who they go and talk to for their information, for their coaching. This harms powerlifting business. This is not, as powerlifting grows as a whole, all federations grow as a whole, all powerlifting gyms grow as a whole. We've seen that happen, but there is still exclusivity. And that is the model that needs to change if there is going to be widespread growth of the sport continuing over the next few years.
I think, and like I have, and I'm certain you have examples of this as well, but I've had lifters who've made the decision to compete in Powerlifting Australia. Either they've competed somewhere else and then decided to make the switch, or they're relatively new to the sport and they go down that road. And as we've said more than once, that's cool. Like, I'm not your mother. You compete where you're going to be happy and I will support you in your choice. But when these lifters, and it's happened on more than one occasion, have submitted their application for membership to Powerlifting Australia, and obviously as part of that you have to list your training location, and they've listed Burleigh Strength, and several of these lifters have then got phone calls from members of the executive that, like, obviously I didn't listen to these phone calls, this is he said, she said stuff, but the implication was that they were doing the wrong thing by training at my gym. I've been referred to as a criminal, or implied that I'm involved in some sort of criminal organization. I've had things like that said about me and my business. I've had people in tears in my office because they've tried to make the decision that they were happy with. They've tried to go down the path that they felt was best for them. And they've been put in a position where essentially they've been forced to make a choice. And for the uninformed lifter, and this is rife, especially with new lifters, they've come in and gone, well, I can't train here anymore because this is the choice I want to make. And all of that's just false for a start. And, you know, in the case of lifters who are a little bit more switched on with understanding the rules, but also just a little bit more confident in themselves, it's not an issue. They just go, yeah, okay, cool, no worries, and hang up. But some of these lifters are really, really worried. They're concerned that they're going to be banned from the federation. They're concerned that they have to then go and train somewhere else. Things like that. And I just think anytime you're using intimidating tactics like that, you're putting people in a position where they have to choose between the federation of a sport that, you know, they're really only relatively new to, or training at the location that they enjoy training at and being involved in a sport with their friends. That exclusivity is just, it's counterintuitive, it's damaging for the sport, and it's something that, like you said, it has to change, because without change on that front, we're going to end up in a position where it's this us versus them mentality. And, you know, I have friends on both sides of this fence, and the people that I talk to regularly from the Powerlifting Australia perspective are people who understand my point of view and I understand theirs, and like, there's no love lost between us because, oh, you choose this and you choose that. We've all got our reasons, and that's fine. Ultimately, it's all just fucking powerlifting. And it's a sport that we all have in common, and we should all be able to celebrate each other's wins and, you know, commiserate with losses and stuff like that. But when you put people in this, like, oh, well, you can only be here and you have to make this choice now, it's not even a choice that you make with some informed decision down the road. This is you draw this line in the sand when you sign that dotted line, and if you're unwilling to cooperate, you'll be banned. And that tactic is, I just think, so bad for the growth of the sport.
And yeah, totally agree on that front. You know, I've seen the very, very good side of that model, but also the ugly side as well. I've been in the same situations that you've kind of just outlined there as well, and it is quite tough. It is quite tough. I think we've said everything that needs to be said. I've got a little red battery flashing on my camera. It's about to die. I lost my proper charger, and I bought an eBay one, and the charger is less than ideal.
Yep, that'll happen.
Yeah. So, yeah. Sam,
are we going to sum things up? I think we've presented all the points reasonably. We are, like, this is a dialogue, right? This is obviously our platform, and we're having this discussion, but feel free to talk to us about it. We will be more than happy to engage in a dialogue. Please don't make it derogatory. Please don't make it the sort of thing that becomes, you did this, you did that. It's all personal attacks. This is a discussion that is about growing the sport that deep down we all really fucking love. And the second you start making it into us versus them, you start making these like personal attacks and stuff like that. That's not what this is about. This is about opening a forum for discussion about what's going to be best for the sport. Not what's going to be best for the federation or what's going to be best for the growth of someone's business, but what's best for the sport. Because ultimately, that's what this is about. It's about the sport of powerlifting. Until we can lose these divides between federations and stuff like that and all move forward in a direction that benefits all of us, I think we're at a loss. The thing I always come back to is that a rising tide floats all boats. Right? Powerlifting is a sport that when it grows exponentially, and we get new people into the sport. We bring people in from all other avenues, and we give them a choice. When you bring people into the sport and your choice is us or not at all, you're not actually growing the sport. You're coming from a scarcity mindset. it's not that there's a limited number of powerlifters in Australia. There are fucking hundreds of them. There are thousands of them, right? And the more avenues these people have to express their strength and their competitive nature in their chosen sport in a way that allows them to do it the way they want, surrounded by their friends and in an environment that is conducive to happy, satisfied lifters who can move forward together, I think that's what we really need in the sport.
I really like the rising tide thing. I think you're going to make me cry if you keep talking like that.
Dude, it's the way I look at business. It's the way I look about life. I think like there's heaps of stuff you can go into about scarcity mindset and stuff like that. But ultimately, it's this idea that your success doesn't impede upon my success. And I think that's the really important part, because so many people, it's like, oh, well, if these people build their federation, we're not going to get any growth on our side. That's fucking bullshit. That's evident by, or is the evidence against that is powerlifting. Because powerlifting has grown on both sides of the fence and everyone benefits. When we all realize that deep down we're all just meatheads who like lifting weights and the divisions that we have between people are arbitrary, I think the sport will move forward.
Awesome. I think that is the perfect way to kind of close this off. Man, thank you so much for your time. As always, really good chat. As John said, hit us up in those comments. Is there comments? Hit us up in general. Tombo7.
We'll figure this shit out, man. That's our media team's problem.
Yeah, media team. Get on that. All right. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Love, Thomas and Chero.